Hi, and welcome to this Authors at Google event. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Gary Marcus. Dr. Marcus is director of the NYU Infant Language Learning Center and professor of psychology at NYU. He asked me to ask if there are any jugglers in the audience, because he's always looking for more jugglers in New York City to practice with. So if you are, come up and talk to him afterwards. Dr. Marcus's book, KLUGE, The Haphazard Organization of the Human Mind, is the topic today. It is a New York Times editor's choice, and Dr. Marcus has a PowerPoint presentation too. So without further ado, Dr. Marcus.
Thank you very much. I'm going to sit today. I usually stand for my talks, but I have a cold. I feel like I should have a banjo or something like that with these tall chairs. Is the sound level okay if I'm sitting like this? Everybody can hear? I'm going to start the discussion today with a sort of optimistic view of the human mind. If you've peeked at the back of the book, you probably realize this isn't my view, but maybe it wasn't even Shakespeare's view. Maybe Hamlet was just kidding, but Hamlet said, "What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty." And that's certainly an optimistic view of the mind. Something like this comes through in a lot of the literature in evolutionary psychology, among other areas. So many of you have probably read Steve Pinker's book, How the Mind Works, and it starts by saying that the parts of the mind that allow us to see are indeed well engineered. And I think that first sentence is uncontroversial. I think that our visual systems are extraordinary. So at the moment, this may change in the next decade, but at the moment, I would still trust a New York City taxi driver over any robot for driving around town. You guys might have technology up your sleeves, and I'm sure eventually that will change. But for many, many thousands of years, our visual systems have been much better than our technological systems for allowing us to see. So Pinker starts from there, from the notion that the visual systems are very good. They can take two-dimensional images and figure out the three-dimensional location of objects in the world. He says, well, if the parts that allow us to see are well engineered, then there's no reason to think that the quality of engineering should progressively deteriorate as the information flows upstream to the faculties that interpret and act on what we see. Now, when I see the words, "there is no reason to think," I'm always a little suspicious. I always kind of want to reach for my wallet. Maybe there is a reason to think that as we go upstream, that maybe the quality of the engineering isn't quite as good. And in fact, I'll be talking about some in a moment. Pinker makes these arguments from evolution, the arguments that we should expect well-engineered systems. Noam Chomsky has been making them recently from a different perspective, which is not so much about evolution. Chomsky isn't a big fan of evolution. I assume he believes in it, but he's not a big fan of evolutionary psychology. But Chomsky comes from a more mathematical perspective. And he finds, or he argues, that language appears to be surprisingly perfect, coming close to what some super engineer would construct, given the conditions that the language faculty must satisfy. So from almost elegance considerations like you might expect in physics, Chomsky's trying to make an argument that perhaps the mind is pretty well constructed, or the language is. And this is very popular in the technical literature. Some of you here probably work with Bayesian models for doing search and things like that, or at least consider those models. So in the technical literature, there's a kind of perspective of the human mind as optimal that comes through lately in terms of Bayesian decision theory, where the idea is that if we get certain kinds of information, we're going to be able to make optimal inferences given that information. And a lot of this traces back in the technical literature about almost 20 years now to some work by John Anderson, what he calls a rational analysis of the human mind. He says many of the major characteristics of human cognition can be explained as an optimal response. And yet, as Groucho Marx once said, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? You know, there might be an argument for human optimality, but surely there are arguments for human non-optimality, one of whom we will get out of office soon enough, maybe not soon enough, but soon. But it's not just the guy on the left who may have damaged his brain in some way or another that I probably shouldn't say on the record. It's not just the guy on the left, but for example, some of the people that voted for him. So you can have your feelings about the 2000 election and whether he actually won. But in 2004, he was reelected, and many of the people that voted for him thought that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And this was 18 months after the invasion. So for those of you who are fans of Bayesianism, you might say, well, what is the data such that people made an optimal inference and decided that there were weapons of mass destruction? So I mean, you could take these kinds of examples as naturalistic evidence that the human mind is not necessarily superlatively well engineered. As Bertrand Russell once said, he was referring to Aristotle's famous quote that man is a rational animal. He says, it's been said that man is a rational animal. All my life I've been searching for evidence which could support this. So clearly there are two views. There's Aristotle's view, and there's the more cynical view of Russell. My own view would be that man is the rationalizing animal, that we're fully prepared to come up with post hoc justifications for what we do, but that doesn't necessarily make us rational. In any case, on the optimistic side, behind a lot of the enthusiasm, is basically faith in evolution. So here's a quote from John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, who, if you know evolutionary psychology, you might know about them. They're the founders of the field, and they say, because natural selection is a hill-climbing process, and that's a very common metaphor and has some substance to it, that tends to choose the best of the variant designs that actually appear. That's certainly what natural selection does. And because of the immense numbers of alternatives that appear over the vast expanse of evolutionary time, natural selection tends to cause the accumulation of superlatively well-engineered functional designs. And I think this is at least the kind of default thinking an evolutionary psychologist. A lot of neuroscientists, I think, take this as background. When I started to write this book, one of my well-known NYU colleagues, whose name I will withhold, said to me, I'm a firm believer in evolution. I'd be surprised if you could find even a single example of something that isn't optimal about the brain. So there's all this optimism because of evolution, and evolution certainly creates things that are pretty good over time, and yet we have George Bush, the people that reelected him, and so forth. This raises the question, what gives? How can we reconcile the supposed power of evolution with the manifest clumsiness of the human mind? Well, the first problem with the optimistic view is that when Pinker and Tooby and Cosmides and so forth talk about vast expanses of time, they're really talking about two different things. The vast expanses of time in which, say, the visual system evolved, I think by any reasonable measure, are in fact vast. So the visual system has been evolving for roughly 1 billion years. So you can find some trace of vision in almost all the creatures on the planet. It's a very common sense. There's been a lot of time for evolution to do a lot of debugging. On the other hand, the things that we think of as distinctively human, like the ability to talk, to go to a lecture, to be able to rationally deliberate about things, those are much more recent. If you look at the archaeological record, there's no clear evidence for language much more than maybe 50,000 or 100,000 years ago. So language and presumably consciousness in the way that we know it, those things are very recent. 100,000 years, that's not a lot of time for evolution to do the debugging. So that there is, in fact, a reason to expect that things might progressively deteriorate, and that's the brevity with which the things that we think of as distinctly human have evolved. The second problem is with the classic hill climbing metaphor, which is not false, but it's sort of usually presented in incomplete fashion. So the metaphor is that over time, other things being equal, on any particular trait, you're going to find yourself moving the population is going to move further and further up a mountain. So this is Mount Fuji, and you can imagine that Mount Fuji represents the eye's sensitivity to light. And at the top of the mountain would be an eye that is sensitive to a single photon in a darkened room. And you can imagine that early on there might have been creatures that were only sensitive to tens of thousands of photons or millions of photons. They gave birth to offspring that were a little bit better at seeing in the dark. Those offspring took over, and those who couldn't see as well died out, and so forth. And you'd repeat this cycle over a number of generations, and in fact, you wind up with what humans have. So humans, in fact, can see a single photon of light in a darkened room. So on that trait, our eyes are pretty close to optimal. The retina is pretty close to optimal. But that doesn't mean that everything is quite as well formed or as smooth as Mount Fuji. If you have a nice smooth surface, then other things being equal, you're going to make it to the top of the mountain. But all the engineers in the room will know the problem of local maximum, which is that you might have a rougher surface. You might have something that's a lot less smooth than Mount Fuji, like the Himalayas. And in the Himalayas, if you followed a strategy of always take only small steps or no steps, which is basically what evolution does. If there's something better, it takes a small step. If there's nothing better, then it sort of stays where it is. If you followed that strategy and you couldn't look out into the distance and remember that evolution is blind, you could easily wind up on some mountain that's tall but way shorter than the highest possible peak. So it's a fallacy to assume that what we call a hill climbing process is necessarily going to get to the highest possible peak. So it's a fallacy to assume that evolution is necessarily going to lead to superlative adaptation. And sometimes, in fact, this evolutionary strategy of gradual change leads to pretty clumsy solutions. So a canonical example for the over 30 set, I know a lot of you are not quite over 30, but for the over 30 set is probably the human spine. Right? The human spine works, it gets the job done. It's a kluge. I imagine I don't need to tell too many people in this room what the word kluge means, but a kluge is a clumsy or inelegant solution to a problem, and the human spine can be thought of that way. It works, it frees up our hands, and that's had a huge impact on our evolution, but that doesn't mean it's the best way that you could support the body weight of a bipedal creature. If you were starting from scratch, you might have tried a different solution, like maybe 4 columns instead of a single column spine, and shock absorbers or something like that. But what we have is a single column, and that's basically like having a flagpole support 70% of your weight. Flagpoles are good for lifting flags. They're not really ideal for lifting all of the body weight of an organism with an unusually heavy brain and so forth. So it's not a particularly good solution, and the consequence, of course, is lots of us have back pain. So evolution sometimes builds kluges like the human spine. So I've already told you that a kluge is something that's clumsy and elegant but good enough. I thought you might like another illustration. I found this on Engadget last summer. Graduate student bolts air conditioner onto car to beat Texas heat. Presumably it gets the job done. It's probably cheaper than having the manufacturer install an air conditioner. On the other hand, it's probably not the slickest ride in town. Probably it was not good for this guy on the dating market. So, it gets the job done, but it's a little bit clumsy. Probably many of you know the Apollo 13 mission, which was maybe the most famous kluge of all time, in which astronauts had to go over to the escape module, and the escape module had the wrong kinds of air filters. And so if you saw the Ron Howard movie, slightly fictionalized, but there's a scene where the engineer on the ground says to his crew, we need to connect this thing to this thing using the stuff in this box. And then he empties out duct tape and rubber bands and socks and so forth, and they kludge together a solution. This really did happen, maybe not exactly the way it happened in the movie. So there was this substitute air filter made out of duct tape and rubber bands. One of the astronauts said it wasn't very handsome, but it worked. That's sort of the heart of what it is to be a kluge. And I'm going to argue that evolution likes making kluges. One last example, I guess you all know MacGyver. I did this in England a couple of weeks ago, when I had a very serious case of food poisoning, and the one on the right took on special significance for me. Anyway, so evolution builds kluges for different reasons. So MacGyver presumably did it for the ratings. The Apollo 13 crew did it to bring the astronauts back home alive. Evolution does it basically because it's blind. Evolution builds kluges because it has no foresight. It can't say, I've built all these 4-legged creatures. They're really cool. I've got horses and I've got cows, but I want to try a 2-legged creature. I haven't really tried that before, except for the kangaroos. And I mean, this is how you'd have to think if you really believed in intelligent design. And then, so I'm going to build a 2-legged creature. What would be the best way of supporting the body weight? Okay, we'll cross brace it and whatever. Evolution can't do that. And it has no hindsight either. So evolution can't say, well, we've built this human species. They've been around for 100,000 years, and in some ways they're really great. They have sophisticated language. They've developed philosophy and logic and poetry, and this is really great. But on the other hand, they're way too aggressive. They never listen to each other. Their languages are ambiguous for no particular reason. Let's just overhaul it. Evolution can't do that. And evolution is always in a hurry. So this, the engineers in the room may identify with. If you have a shipping deadline, then that may prevent you from having the optimal solution. And evolution always effectively has the shipping deadline of now, because the only process that evolution has available is if these genes do well, then they reproduce, and if not, otherwise. So there's no chance to say, we're going to overhaul this. We're going to make humans 2.0. We'll take them offline for 5 years, we'll fix the problems, and we'll re-release then, right? Evolution can't do that. Moreover, the process by which evolution works, people sometimes think of Darwin's phrase as survival of the fittest, but Darwin didn't actually say survival of the fittest, and the phrase is a bit misleading because what it means is fittest among the available options. It doesn't necessarily mean fittest possible. And perhaps that's why Darwin didn't go with that phrase. It was coined later. But anyway, the phrase that he really is associated with and should be associated with is descent with modification. That's the basic process of evolution. You have a set of genes. Some of them get mutated. And if what those new genes do is useful, if they lead to fit offspring that reproduce, then those genes spread around. But the key point is the descent part, that whatever we see now, whatever biological forms we see now, they're all derived from ancestral forms that were at least a little bit similar to them. And so you can trace an unbroken path through your ancestors all the way back to bacteria, right? All of your ancestors succeeded in the reproductive lottery, and they go back and can be traced all the way to bacteria. That means that at any given point, what you find is going to be modified from what's there, and that's not always the best kind of engineering. So a bird's wing, for example, is a modification of the forelimb of all four-legged creatures. It's not something that was designed from scratch, what's the best possible way for flight. And you can tell that if you take away the feathers and look at the bone structure, it's still just a vertebrate forelimb. So in consequence, evolution is not an optimizer, but what Francois Jacob called a tinkerer. And this is his famous metaphor that I think is wonderful. Evolution is more like a tinkerer who often, without knowing what he's going to produce, uses whatever he finds around him, old cardboards, pieces of string, fragments of wood or metal, to make some kind of workable object. Of course, he wasn't here at Google looking at all the Legos and things in your multiple micro kitchens to tinker with. But you get the general idea that evolution is a tinker. It's using spare parts. And when you use spare parts, you don't start from scratch. You can wind up with kluges. So the consequence is what I like to call evolutionary inertia. So that's, of course, modeled on Newton's notion of physical inertia. Newton says an object that's at rest tends to stay at rest, an object that's in motion tends to continue in motion. Well, you can see the same thing in evolution. Once evolution moves in a particular direction, there's no forethought there, but once it moves in that direction, there's a set of basically available spare parts in the form of genes, and evolution tends to conserve those genes. So if you read much biology, you'll hear the word conservation all the time. Before people did all of this genome sequencing, it was easy to imagine that each creature would basically have a genome that was customized to its needs and very different from any other genome. But in reality, it turns out that, for example, something like 85% of the genes in our genome have counterparts in the mouse genome. So the same genes get used over and over again. They get tinkered with. And so that's a kind of inertia. Once you have a lot of single column spines, as you do in four-legged creatures, where it makes sense because you're distributing the load, you might build a spine using a single column design in a vertical creature where it no longer makes sense because you're no longer distributing the load. That's the kind of cost of evolutionary inertia. Now, the idea that there is evolutionary inertia, I think the term is mine, but the idea itself is not new. Darwin talked about sort of useless vestiges and how they might give us some insight into evolution. And I think the person who most thought about these things in recent years is Stephen Jay Gould. Some of you might know his book, The Panda's Thumb, from which this quote is taken. The panda's thumb is a kind of clumsy adaptation that the panda uses in order to strip the bark that it eats. I suspect that the panda's brain is actually much more kludgy than the thumb. Inasmuch as the panda is foolish enough to eat nothing but bamboo even when there are other foods around. It causes the panda no end of trouble. But in any case, Gould's point was the remnants of the past that don't make sense in present terms, the useless, the odd, the peculiar, the incongruous, are the signs of history. So this idea of evolutionary inertia has been around, but I don't think it's really been applied much in evolutionary psychology. There are some scattered places maybe where you would find it, but most evolutionary psychology, and one sees a lot of evolutionary psychology in the technical literature and popular literature, most of it starts from the assumption that the mind is in some way optimized for some particular function and says, well, what was the function that our ancestors were facing, and that explains why we are now. This notion of evolutionary inertia hasn't played a big role. That's where kluge comes in. Kluge is about three things: the limits of the human mind, so the mental kluges that might saddle our thinking, where they came from in evolutionary terms, and ultimately what we might do about them. So my sort of central test case is going to be about human memory, and I'm going to say some flattering things, or may say some flattering things about Google itself. I want you to know that I always say them. I'm not just saying them for your benefit. But so I'm going to talk about human memory. And I'm going to talk about machine memory and ultimately maybe a little bit of what I understand about how your search engine works. So just about every creature on the planet uses a particular kind of memory that goes by a lot of different names. There's no particularly elegant name for it, but some people call it cue-driven memory, context-dependent memory. It means that you use a series of cues to get at what you're looking at, which in some ways is a little bit like Google. Before I get, though, to biological memory and how it works, I want to either teach you or remind you how computer memory works. So I know this will be old news for half the people in the crowd, but maybe not for the other half. Computer memory, the way it works is there's some master map for where everything is stored. So everything belongs in a particular location. For non-programmers, you could think of a metaphor maybe of safe deposit boxes. So the nice thing about computer memory is it's a little bit like a series of safe deposit boxes. You put something in box number 17, and you have the expectation that if you go there 20 years later, in box 17 are going to be the papers that you put there. So it's a very reliable system. It means, for example, that in a computer, you only need to store a phone number once, and it's there forever. So you take a trip to England, you visit some of your friends, you put the cell numbers in your cell phone, you come back 5 years later if you've synchronized your cell phone, and it's still all there. It's a very reliable system. Our memories, of course, are not nearly as reliable. So my canonical experience with trying to remember phone numbers on one trial these days is I get a call on my cell phone, somebody leaves a message, they say, call me back at 623-8164 in area code 917. And by the time they get to the area code, I've lost the thing. And now what I'm trying to do, I'm panicking. I'm trying to remember what is the digit that I press to replay the message, right? I can't acquire a phone number in a single trial like a computer can. There are lots of things that are almost trivial for a computer that are really difficult for us. So one example is, where did I put my keys? Computer programmers would think, well, if I were building a robot and it needed keys, I would put a buffer that would update the location every time I use the keys, and there would be no problem. But obviously for human beings, there's a problem. What is the problem specifically? Well, the problem is that we're always balancing two things, which you might call recency and frequency. So our memories really depend on having things recur a lot. That's frequency. But what we want for the keys is recency. We only want the most recent place. What often happens is you put the keys in an unusual place, and then recency and frequency conflict, and sometimes you wind up sort of remembering where you usually put your keys rather than where they are now, which is, of course, what you're trying to remember. Not a very good system. Another example is, where did I park my car? Now, this is not a great example in Manhattan, but probably some of you have had this experience at some time in your life, or you at least can imagine it. If you park in the same garage every time, every day you leave work, you know the general tendency very well. You know perfectly well what lot you parked your car in. That's not a problem. But remembering where you put your car is very difficult. Well, why is that? It's because you have no problem storing this each time you park your car. Last week you had no problem storing it. The day before you had no problem storing it. But you have trouble sifting through all of those memories. So when you try to remember where your car is today, you might get confused. You just sort of know, well, somewhere over there, but was that where I parked last week? When you think about it from an engineering perspective, this is quite pathetic, because once you took your car from the spot that it was in last week, you don't even need that piece of information anymore. But evolution didn't bless us with an erase operation. So there you are sifting between a whole bunch of irrelevant pieces of memory. This is why pilots have to use checklists. So we have this fundamental interference problem that if you have multiple memories that respond to the same cues, I guess it'd be like having a lot of search hits, you get in trouble and you can't find the one that you want. So pilots have to use checklists because they can't remember, for example, did I pull up the landing gear today? After you've had hundreds or thousands of flights, you might get confused. You might think you pulled up the landing gear today, but you're actually confusing it with one of these early memories. So that's why it's absolutely essential to have a checklist, which brings me to the last line on the slide, which is if you're skydiving, you don't have the luxury of a checklist. The first time that you go skydiving, that's not a problem because you only have two things on your mind. The first is, I'm going to tell my friends that I enjoy this, even though I'm scared shitless and want to throw up. And the second is, I'm going to pull the ripcord, and you manage. Very few people die on their first skydiving attempt. On the other hand, if you look at the statistics, 6% of all skydiving fatalities are from people that forgot to pull the ripcord. I submit to you that is a design flaw, reflects a design flaw in human memory. The problem is the same as with the airline pilots. They confuse it. If you've done it 60 times, you could forget. You could think you've pulled the ripcord because you've done it so many times and not, in fact, have done it. So not an ideal system for memory. All right. The reason that our memories aren't particularly reliable is we don't have the master maps. And the difference between Google and human memory is both human memory and Google use a kind of system of cues, but you've got a master map where it says where all the servers have the information. We don't have that. So another metaphor would be something like a shoebox full of photographs before the digital era. Usually the memory that you want or the photograph that you want is the most recent one. It's close to the top. You find it. But there's no guarantee that anything's particularly well organized. And I would submit that it's not just that you have no idea where in your brain any particular memory is. So yes, all your memories are stored in your hippocampus or the frontal lobes, and I'm sure the neuroscientists will straighten that out sometime in the next 10 years. But they're not entirely straight about it now. But even your brain doesn't really know where the specific memories are. It uses this kind of broadcast system where it says, anybody there got any information relevant to the breakfast that I had recently? you're trying to remember the breakfast that you had yesterday. And you might get several responses and you get confused. You can't remember what you had for breakfast yesterday. If the brain knew it, it'd be able to pull it out. But empirical data are that these kinds of things interfere, that the brain doesn't really know where individual memories are. The best it can do is to send out a set of cues and hope for the best. The thing about it is this shoebox-like system, contextual memory, context-dependent memory, whatever you want to call it, it's been around a really long time. So it's a really strong case of evolutionary inertia. Whatever genes are involved in building memory are massively conserved, and that's borne out from what little we understand about the genes in the evolution in the literature on biology. The genes that are used in memory that we understand, they're used in worms, they're used in flies, they're used in people. And from a behavioral perspective, you can find the same kinds of weird phenomena that are sort of hallmarks of this context-dependent memory. So my favorite example of this was a study that they did with scuba divers. They said, we want you to memorize a list of words while you're underwater. And the words had nothing to do with being underwater, but it was like, table and chair and house or whatever. And then they test people a couple days later, and the question is, do they remember these words now better when they're underwater or when they're on land, or is there no difference? Now, as somebody who has gone scuba diving with something like the skydiving experience of wanting to tell my friends but not really enjoying it, I would think it'd be hard to remember the words underwater, because when I was underwater, all I did was think, remember to breathe, right? And so I wouldn't think that would be winning conditions for remembering things very well, but it turns out that if you memorize the words underwater, you're better at remembering them later if you're tested underwater, even though the list has nothing to do with it. So this is why I sometimes have up on the slide, it might actually be true that if you studied while you were stoned, you might actually be better off taking the test while you were stoned, which doesn't mean that you should, but anyway. Okay, so we have this weird thing called context-dependent memory, which means that these arbitrary cues are relevant. Another paper that just came out a year or so ago showed what they called posture-dependent memory. So you're all sitting, or almost all of you are sitting down now. If you wanted to remember this later, you want to tell your partner about it or something like that, you do better if you're sitting down then than if you're lying or swimming or something like that. So this context-dependent memory is all over the animal world. So it was originally discovered in rats. Somebody ran mazes. This is what psychologists always do with rats, or at least did until very recently. So somebody did, like in 1917, did an experiment running rats through mazes, and electrical lighting was just becoming relatively popular. And he discovered that if you trained the rat with the lighting on and then you tested it with natural light later, the rat didn't do as well. So this is a hallmark of the animal world, and it's a great example of evolutionary inertia. I would argue that the human mind would be better off if we had some location addressable memory like computers have, where we could just go to a particular spot and know that particular bits of information were there. But instead, all we're left with is this queue addressable memory that has all of these interference problems. So I think that's the biggest way in which evolutionary inertia has shaped the mind. I'm going to kind of try to elaborate that in a moment. So I've already given you the scuba diver thing. I'll just give you one more illustration of the power of cues and clues. If I ask you who is the 16th president of the United States, probably most of you sort of had to memorize a table of these things when you were in school, but most people would have trouble with it. And then I can give you another clue. I could say he was a good writer, and for those who like writing, that might be enough of a clue. If it's not, you might work backwards and say, well, Bush probably wasn't a good writer, and maybe you could figure it out from there. Or I could give you a stronger clue, and eventually you get it. I tell you he freed the slaves, and the one with the tall hat and the long beard, and eventually you get it. So that's how cue-driven memory works. It's not very well suited to the needs of modern humans, though. I've already given you these examples about where you put your keys, where we need these very specific bits of information. Another very, very salient example where our memory is, because it's context-driven and there is no location-addressable component, is really not cut out for modern life is with eyewitness testimony. So in eyewitness testimony, you're expected to remember a particular event at a particular time, all of the details. Well, we don't have time date stamps, right? I mean, the computer, every time you update a file, there's a time date stamp that's adjusted, or you can think of video cameras that stamp every frame. We don't have that. Without location-addressable memory, it'd be pretty hard to build it, I suspect. And so you get cases like the Sean Bell case that just happened in New York City, where a guy was shot by the cops. There were like 50 eyewitnesses or 30 eyewitnesses, and nobody agreed what happened. The officers were acquitted. I don't know if they were guilty or not, but they were acquitted, I think, in large part because no one could agree on what happened. There's actually, if you're curious, you can look on the New York Times website. They have something where they summarized, I think it's 30 witnesses, not 50 like I have on the slide, and they summarize what each witness said on the prosecution and defense, and they're just all over the map. Our brains are not cut out to be able to give good eyewitness testimony because you can confuse together many different things. What happened at the scene of the crime, what you thought about it later that night when you were thinking about it, which might not be correct, what the lawyer asks you about it later. So we really are suggestible when people ask us questions. It can interfere with the memories and so forth. So we're not cut out for eyewitness testimony. I've already given you the skydiver story, sad though it is. Flaws in human memory extend well beyond everyday recall, though. So it's not just that we can't remember things as reliably as Google. I should say that I think that Google is the best of both worlds, Google as search engine, as opposed to company. I guess it's not usually salient to both meanings when I give this talk. But the technology behind Google works basically by marrying the best features of the two. You've got location addressable memory like computers underneath, and then you build context addressable memory on top. So you can use your clues, but the clues are guaranteed to get you to the original piece of information. We don't have that. That's problematic. What I want to say now is that it goes beyond. So it goes beyond just phenomena that we would think of directly as being about memory. So you might take for granted our memory doesn't work very well. Evolutionary inertia did us a disservice by giving us only context-dependent memory without location-addressable memory, but it's even worse than that. So cue-driven memory has all kinds of consequences for how we reason about the world. For example, it makes us very vulnerable to spin doctors. Take Karl Rove's bit of evil genius, death tax versus the estate tax. Now, these are exactly the same thing, right? They are taxes on people's inheritance. But one of them tends to make people very happy, and the other tends to make them very upset. So death tax sounds like a really, truly awful deal. It's pretty awful that we have to die, and then you're going to go and tax somebody because they died. That seems like a total jip. No way is anybody for that, right? An estate tax, that seems fine. Because who has estates? Well, that's wealthy people, and they're not paying their share anyway, so fine, tax them. So people think death tax is terrible, estate tax is fine. Of course, they're the same thing. Whether your policy on them should be identical, and people aren't. Even relatively intelligent people, unless you force them to reflect on the identity between the two, they may wind up with very different conclusions. Another favorite example of mine is the soap that's 99% pure. That sounds great. I'll take 2. It's practically organic. And then you think 1% toxic. Is that what the other 1%? Maybe I'll just put it back on the shelf, right? So you have these things, again, they're identical, but we think about them really differently. This is a phenomenon known as framing. Why does framing matter so much? Well, I think that we can trace it back to the memory system. So again, many of you are programmers, you'll know the wonderful phrase garbage in, garbage out. For those who don't already know it, the idea is you can have a perfect software system with lousy data leads to wrong conclusions. I was giving this talk in the UK a couple of weeks ago, and I had a driver there, and he told me that he had just gone with his GPS system in the UK up to, I think it's Sweden, where they drive on our side of the road as opposed to the British side of the road. And every time he got to a roundabout, the system would tell him to go the wrong way on the roundabout. And then he would go the proper way so that he wouldn't die. And it would go recalculating. So there was nothing wrong with the GPS system's ability to read the satellite signals or to calculate routes and so forth, but that parameter was misset, so the maps were all wrong. So garbage in, garbage out means if you have lousy data, you wind up with lousy conclusions. Often our reasoning systems are pretty good, and we have no idea how much they're being led about by the arbitrariness of the data that we're sampling from in order to do the reasoning. So the problem with death tax versus estate tax is you're reasoning from different premises. You're thinking about different things. If you could think about them in the same way, then you might be able to rationally reason about them and say, well, how much is the net impact on the economy and so forth. But we tend to take very biased samples of data and just reason with them as if they were representative data. And a lot of that is driven by memory because context-driven memory gives you stuff that happens to match a particular set of criteria. So death tax basically pulls up a different set of memories than estate tax does. Okay. The second example is scientific reasoning. So we as a species are very vulnerable to something known as confirmation bias. This means you have a theory, you notice evidence that supports that theory, you're not very good at retrieving evidence that goes against that theory. This happens to all human beings. Scientists, in particular, work hard to not be vulnerable to this, and graduate school is partly about getting people to overcome confirmation bias, but it's very deep within the human beings, and scientists do it too, is the honest truth. Over time, what happens when you have a species full of people with confirmation bias is everybody thinks that they're right, that they know the one truth and nobody else does. And so maybe the most obvious reflex of this is in religion, where people think that they know the one true deity or set of deities and so forth. It happens with political candidates. So, people that might have gotten along in the Clinton and Obama camps really didn't get along because they could only see the arguments for their candidate. Domestically, another example of this is if you ask people that share an apartment, what percentage of the dishes did you do? And let's say there are two people there. One person tells you 60%, the other person tells you 70%. I guarantee the numbers will never add up to 100%. They will always exceed 100%. This is also true in scientific papers. The graduate student, the professor, you ask what proportion, it always adds up to 250. This, again, is kind of a data and sampling problem. When you think about who did the dishes, you think about your own cases. You're very good at remembering them. They're more accessible to you. And so of the things that you can remember of the times the dishes were done, you actually remember 75% of them are you doing the dishes. But you're not compensating for the fact that a lot of cases when the other person did the dishes aren't coming to your mind very readily. So we get this polarization over time. We have a species where every single person thinks that they know the truth. And then in case they weren't sure about it, they think about the data that goes with their beliefs, seems to fit with them, and they're happy. There's a term in the literature called make sense reasoning. And the idea is as in, makes sense to me. In the sort of, you look at the argument, you see the data, you're happy, and you don't keep pursuing it to see what alternative hypotheses might be there. I think that cue-driven memory, this fundamental piece of evolutionary inertia that I'm focusing on today, also contributes to mental illness. So consider, for example, depression. What happens in depression? Something bad usually triggers it off. Depression doesn't usually come from nowhere. Usually there's some genuinely bad experience. But what happens after that bad experience is that people ruminate on it. So somebody has a fight with their girlfriend, and then they think about the other nasty things that their girlfriend has done. They get really mad at their girlfriend. They start listening to breakup songs. And the next thing you know, they're depressed, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Paranoia is sort of the same thing. You get one reason to mistrust somebody, and then you think about all the other things, and you convince yourself that you're correct. This is, again, a kind of data sampling problem. And it comes because cue-driven memory means that being depressed leads you to think about more depressing things. That any particular state tends to get polarizing. So we have some ability, normal healthy people have some ability to cut off these cycles, but it's an intrinsic part of the human wiring of the mind, given the memory systems that we have, that we are vulnerable to these ongoing cycles. The last example I will give is a little bit about linguistics, and a sort of puzzling fact about linguistics. So Chomsky has always been interested in the fact that human languages are just sort of one set of languages among a space of possible languages. So all human languages seem to have some properties in common. That's what Chomsky talks about as universal grammar. And the set of human languages are, for example, different from computer programming languages. So no computer can really be programmed with a human language and vice versa. Computer programming languages kind of overlap with mathematical languages. For those of you who have entirely too much time on your hands, you can take immersion courses in Klingon. Klingon presumably is different from human language and so forth. One of the most salient differences between human languages and programming languages is that human languages have a lot of ambiguities that seem kind of needless from a design perspective. So, for example, in English, you can say the spy shot the cop with a revolver. Most people will assume that what I mean is that the revolver was the instrument with which the spy shot the cop. The spy could have used a crossbow, but he thought a revolver would be more effective. But of course, it doesn't have to mean that. It could be that there was one cop with a revolver, another with a nightstick, and the spy thought, I'll get rid of the one with a revolver first, I'll move on to the nightstick guy later. So that sentence is ambiguous, and lots of sentences are. Put the cop on the towel on the table, and so forth. There's a study that came out a couple years ago where they looked at just how good are people at realizing that these ambiguities exist and at coping with them. And it was a social psychology study. If you've heard social psychology studies, they typically rely on fooling people, on sort of like my favorite study that relates to memory stuff is a study that they did at NYU. John Barge did at NYU. He had people unscramble anagrams that happened to have a particular set of words like Florida and the elderly. And then people thought what they were doing is unscrambling words, but what he was really interested in was how long did it take them to walk to the elevator afterwards? And it turns out if you hear words like Florida and elderly, it primes some stereotype in your head, and people walk more slowly to the elevator afterwards. So that's a sort of canonical social psychology study, and I give lots more in KLUGE. There's one that I don't give in KLUGE that just came out that I'll mention since you like that one so much. If you ask people moral dilemmas, like, is it okay to throw the fat guy over the bridge in order to stop the trolley, you may have heard these kinds of problems, such that it saves 5 people. Well, people will give you different kinds of answers, depends on how the problem is posed. But if you ask them this question, John Haidt just published this experiment, if you ask them this question in a messy room, they'll give you a different answer than if you ask them in a neat room. So even our sort of most apparently rational, high-level moral reasoning is affected by all of this sort of flotsam and jetsam that's floating through the mind. Anyway, and so that was another example of deception. But back to this study by Boaz Kazar, the Rick moved the grill under the porch study, there was no deception here, unlike most social psychology studies. He said, this is an ambiguous sentence, and he explained what ambiguity is. And he said, I want you to read it aloud, and I want you to tell me whether the other guy in the room understands it. And then the other guy in the room was also a subject in the experiment. He was supposed to write down which meaning the first guy meant and whether you understood it or not. It turns out people wildly overestimate their ability to communicate clearly. They think that other people understand what they're saying. It's part of a more general problem called the curse of knowledge. We assume that people know what it is that we're thinking. So if there's a rare word, we assume if we know it, everybody else knows it, for example. So there's a general fact about human mind. In any case, the point is that language by itself has a lot of ambiguity. We kludge around it. We use a whole bunch of things to get around the fact that sentences themselves are often ambiguous. So for example, we use eye contact, we point at things, we use common knowledge. So maybe it doesn't make sense that there was no cop there with a revolver, and so we use that to disambiguate the sentence. So we have this illusion that language is relatively clear, but as people who try to write parsers know, human language is actually quite ambiguous. Somebody actually tried to solve this problem in the late 1950s. A linguist named James Cook Brown created a language which he called Logland, for logical language. You can look it up on the web later. And he wanted to do this in service of one of the sort of most sexy hypotheses in cognitive science, which is the hypothesis is that the language that you think in mediates the way that you think about the world. So the famous case of this, which has a rather sad history, I'll tell you in a second, but the famous case of this was that Worf thought that Hopi speakers didn't have any words for time and that they didn't understand what time was. Now, it turns out he just didn't understand Hopi. Hopi speakers do understand time, do have words for time, and it's sort of embarrassing. But it's still a very interesting hypothesis. So what Cook Brown set out to do was to sort of clean up the sloppiness in human thinking. So you may have guessed I'm not the first person to talk about the sloppiness of human thinking. And my contribution is to try to figure out why it exists, why it evolved. But people have been writing for years about how pathetic human reasoning is. So you've got, for example, the Russell tradition. And so he thought, we'll just build a language where you have to make your premises explicit and you have to make your sentences unambiguous, and then we'll have this wonderful test of the Worf hypothesis. We'll see, do these people in fact think straight if we get them to talk straight? There was only one problem with his plan, which is nobody could actually learn the language. It was a poor fit to the human mind. Right? So you can, if you look it up on the web, you will find out that some people, after a great deal of practice, were able to hold like 15-minute phone conversations or something like that. But people weren't really able to acquire the language. Now, the perfect experiment hasn't been done. I would like to teach a child Logland. It hasn't been done. But here's my guess, is that imposing perfection in the sense of getting rid of these ambiguities might be on human language might be like putting a square peg in a round hole. Our brains just aren't set out aren't cut out to be able to do the representation that you would need. So what would you need in order to solve this problem? It's really very simple. Anybody who's gone through 4th grade mathematics will recognize the solution. All you would need is parentheses, right? The spy shot the parentheses cop with the revolver. I was warned about that. The spy shot the cop parentheses with the revolver. You just put the parentheses where you want in order to indicate the bracketings. Anybody who's programmed in Lisp or something like that will be very familiar with putting parentheses around things in order to indicate how they're bracketed together. So it would be very easy in principle, but it would be extremely difficult for the human mind to cope with it, I think. So anybody who's actually programmed Lisp will realize that at some point somebody noticed that it was very hard for anybody to keep straight the parentheses. They don't know which one matches up with which other one. They would get lots of syntax errors and so forth. So somebody invented the trick of having the right parenthesis flash or sorry, the left parentheses flash when you hit a particular right parenthesis. This itself is a kludge to work around the fact that the human mind doesn't have location addressable memory such that you can't keep track of where the parentheses are. So if you can't do it on the screen, a screen is a kind of external memory, you're probably not going to be able to do it in an auditory stream as it's going by. So I would submit to you, even if we had parentheses in language, people wouldn't be very good at being able to cope with it. And if there are questions, I can give you some more examples from sort of linguistics literature where I think this pops up. The bottom line is our languages, I think, are ambiguous not because that's some element of good design, not because you would build a language like that from first principles, but because the memory system that we're stuck with because of evolutionary inertia makes it that way. So here's the summary. I don't want to say that the human mind is lousy. There are kluges. I don't know if the brain is sort of 20% kluge or 80% kluge. I don't even know how you count that. There are some things that are very good about the design of the human mind, like the fact that we have language at all. I think it's fair to say that the human mind is the crown jewel of evolution. But that doesn't by any stretch make it perfect. That doesn't by any stretch mean that we're these Bayesian inference engines that are always optimal at taking information and making the right inference on any occasion. It doesn't even mean we're the best possible compromise available. So you could imagine somebody saying, well, yeah, you have a finite brain, it's got to use a limited amount of energy, but given those constraints, we're the best possible. I don't buy that. I think our memory system, for example, would do very well if it worked more like the search engines in Google. If we had location addressable memory at bottom, context addressable memory at top. I don't see any resource limitation that keeps us from that. I think it's just sheer evolutionary accident and evolutionary inertia. As a side point, which I already made briefly, I think it's pretty clear from these kinds of examples that we couldn't possibly be the product of intelligent design because all of these are sort of blunders. They're unintelligent design. To close, some of our mental machinery is elegant, but I think a lot of it with little foresight could have been a lot better. And I guess the last thing that I will say, especially in an engineering crowd, is I think that doing an analysis of the human mind, I'm sort of working out the specs and where the specs are different from the ideal, gives us opportunity, for example, to think about the kinds of software that one might use to get around people's memory limitations or the kinds of technology. So for example, cell phones are a way of helping us with our memory, but you can think more broadly in terms of the limits we have on attention, on reasoning, and so forth, whether there's any technologies that we might use to augment human cognition to deal with the cases where we are a little bit kludgy and things could have been a little bit better. I thank you very much. I would be very happy to take questions. It looks like my first customer is arriving.
Thank you for coming. I have a question about the cue-driven memory, and if you could talk about like NLP and how those sort of techniques stop those cue-drivens.
NLP is in neuro-linguistic programming, or
like the techniques behind it to stop like negative images and things like that, and if you find that like successful or whatnot.
I don't actually know much about NLP in particular, but I think it is possible for us to use, so I mean, cluge I didn't talk about, but that you should already be familiar with, is we have a kind of split mind. We have ancestral systems, I call them reflexive systems, that do stuff automatically, and we have modern systems that allow us to do deliberate reasoning and make long-term goals and all of this kind of stuff. We can use those modern systems to kind of control the ancestral system. So a lot of these things, like the ruminative cycles, they are amenable to change. So one thing that's common in cognitive and behavioral therapy, and it may be similar in NLP, is you get people to recognize that they are, in fact, engaging in these ruminative cycles, and you teach them strategies. You say, when you find yourself thinking the same thought several times in a row, try to force yourself to think about something different. And these strategies can be good. So we can use our modern systems to, I mean, it's a workaround. It's a kludge, right? That you have to sort of use this extra mental energy to do something that the system isn't clever enough to do in the first place. But it is possible to do them. I think a lot of the tools that people can use for mental health, either in extreme cases where they're not mentally healthy or just for normal people, is self-monitoring, self-awareness, being aware of the cases where you're putting too much mental energy without much return. I just had a piece in the Times, in the UK version of the Times, about worrying. They changed the title. I had something like why worrying isn't always useful, and they changed it to why worrying isn't useful, or something like that. And that's too strong. But a lot of worrying that we do is the same kind of ruminative thing, where you burn up a lot of cycles where you can't fix things. One way to think about that is our systems are tuned to short-term worry. So, you're a four-legged creature and another four-legged creature wants to eat you. What do? It's either fight or flight, and your cortisol levels elevate, and you have a way of dealing with that. But we have long-term worries, like, what is Microsoft going to come up with next or something like that you need to think about, but that if you think about in the same way with the same elevated stress levels is not actually useful. What you really want to do is to be relaxed, and maybe that's why your clever founders have all of these ways, Legos and stuff like that. That's a good thing. If you just allow your natural stress response to run, it's going to run with these long-term worries that are much harder to deal with, and elevating cortisol isn't the right way to respond. So that's another example of clumsiness. I imagine that NLP works on similar principles. I don't know enough about the detail.
Thanks.
So thank you for this interesting talk. So if we know that the brain is a cluge, how could we use this information in all parts of human knowledge? For example, would you have now a guidebook for politicians? This is how you influence people by framing your arguments, or could use this for other people? This is when people are framing the argument. So could you use this information, all kinds of human endeavor, to know our limitations and overcome them?
The last chapter of the book is about exactly that topic. So I'll give you two examples. One is there's some very simple advice. It sounds, some of the reviewers have thought it's obvious, but very simple advice that's actually effective and can make a huge difference. And there's empirical data for it. One of the simplest things is think about alternative hypotheses. If you condition yourself to make that a habit, which not everybody does, then you stop doing this make sense reasoning, you start being more balanced, the quality of your reasoning is going to improve. If you routinely say, when you have an important decision, now it's costly, you can't do this, if you're trying to decide between Coke and Pepsi, you can't do this every time. But if you have a serious decision to make, you can say, I'm going to really consider alternative hypotheses. I'm not just going to evaluate the choice that I'm thinking of making, but also the alternatives. People routinely miss opportunity costs and things like that. So if you get yourself in the habit of thinking about alternative hypotheses, the quality of reasoning can improve. Second kind of example that I give in the book is I talk about what we might do for children. So the ways that schools are organized is mostly still, even 200 years after Dickens and Gradgrind, and I want you to remember a fact, it's still mostly about memorization. We teach children a little bit about how their digestion works, but we don't really teach them much about how their mind works. I think it's possible to teach kids these things, like these are the kinds of cognitive errors that you're likely to make and why they're costly. And so the thing I end the book with is a discussion of another book called Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery, which was written a little bit before Harry Potter, and is about a young child who is interested in thinking. He has to write an essay for school about something that he thinks is interesting. And he says, the planets are interesting, blah, blah, blah. But thinking is what interests me. So you can imagine this little boy is a man after my own heart. You can use this as the core for a curriculum to teach children philosophy. And you can get them to be more sensitized to this kind of stuff, thinking about alternative hypotheses and so forth. And there's a little data, not a lot of data yet, but a little bit of very promising data that I talk about at the end of the book that suggests that's a good way of improving people's mental habits.
Hi, kind of following on that question, I'm a new parent with a two-month-old. You're more than welcome to teach him logland. My question is, I'm doing a lot of reading on child development. I'm finding your books and Steven Pinker's on one side, and I'm finding pop literature like The Secret on the other side. There's nothing in between for an educated, scientific parent. So,
in terms of sort of child-rearing manual.
Exactly. So is that because there isn't enough of an audience, or it's not
I think there's a
possible?
huge audience. I think that the scientists don't want to write the book because they know how little we know. I actually just walked by one of these book stalls at front of NYU the other day and saw a book that I loved as a child. I don't think I actually read it. I just loved the title, and I still do, which is The Encyclopedia of Ignorance. I think that being a good scientist is knowing what you don't know. I think the truth is that there's not a lot of good clinical data for most of the questions that parents actually want answers for. And so I would be afraid to write such a book. I would feel like if I wrote it as a scientist, that I would inevitably, A, outstrip the knowledge that I have, and B, people would assume because I was a scientist that I knew what I was talking about. And so the stuff that I know about is sort of abstract stuff that is true for all kids. So I know something general about how children learn language. But in terms of is it better to have your babies listen to Mozart? There isn't clear data on it. I have one sort of general piece of advice, which is that I think that what children need is a reasonably stimulating environment, that the best data that's out there suggests that a really impoverished environment's a terrible thing. So if, there's no access to books and no, but that it sort of looks like a curve like this, where really deprived environments are bad, but after that it's not clear that the sort of waves in which people try to finally parse things matter. So at least in the language domain, for example, every normal kid acquires language. And so like some parents are really worried about correcting their children's grammar and things like that. It doesn't look like that's really necessary. I mean, kids are sort of, from a mathematical perspective, they're a function from hearing sentences to picking up their grammar. They don't need any help for that. On the other hand, vocabulary, if you don't use big words, they don't learn them. So, treating kids as if they're intellectually able is probably not a bad idea. But the book that you really want, and that I might want soon, possibly, I'm not sure anybody feels comfortable writing it. So, there are people that feel comfortable writing and don't know about the science, like, I guess maybe The Secret's like that. I haven't read it. But we don't have great clinical data. And I guess part of that is because most people are not so generous about letting, people do these kinds of experiments on their kids. And human subjects boards want to make sure that, everything is safe for the kids and stuff like that. But you look like you want to follow up.
Well, I do, because there is a lot of experimentation going on in areas like life longevity. Authors like Ray Kurzweil are writing about this, and people are willing to experiment with this thing. Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's any lack of interest in parents to experiment with their children. I mean, I'm not going to stick them in acid or anything, but
I mean, there's some ways in which what you say is certainly true. So, first of all, adults, it's easier to do the experiments because they can give informed consent. If you're talking about doing experiments on 2-month-olds, the standards have to be higher because they have no role in deciding it. And around the edges, there are some parents that are willing to experiment in ways that seem very dangerous to me. Like, some parents will probably be happy to give their kids human growth hormone in order to have their kids be better athletes.
Or teach them loglan.
Probably loglan is more harmless than on the loglan matter, I don't think there actually would be that much harm involved as long as they had a normal native language. Okay. And the human growth hormone, I think there was. So I don't know. The human subjects boards are an issue there, and we work these things out, but slowly.
Okay, thank you.
Budgets are another. Thanks.
How do we know that some of these things that the human brain is bad at are really suboptimal, in the sense that it could be a trade-off, right?
Mm-hmm.
That where our brain, even if we were to design it perfectly, it would make sense to make it be not so good at remembering the car, where we park the car, but on the other hand, it's good at being creative, let's say, because if we remember the last 500 times we parked our car somewhere, it's junk, but a few of those times, the car next to mine is similar and it had different wheels, and that's stuck in my back of my mind. So next time I'll have the idea that these other wheels exist. So
I think your question is the right one, and I think that it actually has to be worked out in individual domains. So, it could be that in some places the brain or the body or whatever has achieved optimal compromises. So in locomotion, we're pretty darn efficient. We're pretty close to optimal. There are systems that I think are demonstrably optimal given the trade-offs. I think memory is actually a good example where we have an existence proof, and here I am sucking up again, but there is an existence proof that a better memory system exists, and that's a search engine. So in that case, I don't see the advantage that we get from the sort of unreliability of our memory. The common thing for people to think, and this is, I think, a sort of mental virus that you can attribute to Freud, is people think that we can repress our memories. So, you could imagine, okay, an organism has limited memory. The reality is that it seems like we can remember everything. The problem is on retrieval. But Freud has this notion of repressing memories, and you could imagine we would somehow we would improve our mental health by not being able to remember the upsetting things or something like that. But the reality is that people can't repress memories very well. So if you look at Holocaust survivors or soldiers coming back and so forth, they have post-traumatic stress disorder. They can't get rid of the memory. So I think in that particular case, the way in which many people imagine memory to be optimal simply isn't true. So your general point is certainly right. In any particular case where somebody says, this thing is suboptimal, it's perfectly okay for someone else to try to construct a scenario under which it is optimal. There's a lot of freedom there because you can say, well, optimal in terms of energetic computation, optimal, there's lots of optimal in terms of, I don't know, popularity or whatever. So I think there's room to make those kinds of arguments. I think memory is a really good case where there's really no good argument that would be better off with what we have as opposed to a location addressable substrate with a context addressability on top.
Well, maybe I'll throw out a counterexample. But
Okay.
I don't know if it's a really good one. But what about like face recognition, for example? Something that the human brain is exceptionally good at remembering faces. The computers, even supercomputers
Yeah.
with all the CPUs in the world, are very bad.
I mean, I said vision is very good, and it could be that one of the reasons that vision is very good has something to do with the memory substrates. But even if it were, I would still say, for example, that for say linguistic processing, that we would be better off if we had at least some of this location addressable memory available. So it's possible that there are some systems that use context-dependent memory very well, but there are still systems, I think, ultimately that would be better served by having the location addressable memory. All of these things about where I put things, for example, would be better off with the location addressable memory. And why not have both kinds of circuits? I think it's because evolution just didn't get there. Let me take the next question now.
Kind of a follow-up to that question. You kind of argue that ambiguity is one of our weaknesses, but you could also argue that it's one of our best strengths.
Well, I think we put it to good use in literature, but I would distinguish between deliberate ambiguity and inadvertent ambiguity.
Right.
So deliberate ambiguity, somebody asks you out on a date and you're not really sure, you don't want to hurt their feelings, and you kind of give a vague answer. That's one thing. But it's another when a pilot answers a question, "Where are you?" and he says, "At takeoff," and the control tower doesn't understand. I have this in the book, and 600 people die. So that's inadvertent ambiguity. And you could try to do some metric of the deliberate versus the inadvertent. But if you had parentheses, you'd always have the option, and that to me seems like a sort of trivial thing to hope for, but we didn't get.
Right. Well, from the other end, people have spent a lot of time, as you probably know, trying to get computers to think the way that humans do. And so, it doesn't seem like, what if there is no way to have both things? What if the very act of learning something in a certain way kind of rewires our brain so that we're incapable of thinking about things in the way that we're thinking of them now?
I mean, it's possible. If we had started this argument sort of in advance of investigation and done it like 50 years ago, then we could have said that about memory. And I think that the lesson of search engines is that, at least in some domains, it's possible to pick and choose the best of both worlds. So I'm not saying that computers are just better than people. I mean, they're not at vision. They're not even at the game Go. Maybe we can beat, computers can beat humans in chess, but they can't in Go. There are lots of things that computers don't do as well as humans. But I think that if one wants to think towards the future in terms of building best possible systems, one wants to say, well, what do the humans do well? What do the machines do well? And I mean, as you're sort of asking, can they be combined? And there may be some principled reasons in some domains where they can't. I think memory is a good case where they, in fact, empirically, demonstrably have been, where you got a search engine that takes the best of computers, location addressability, the best of the mind, which is the queue addressability and some of the caching and stuff like that. You put it all together, you got something that's better than either of its predecessors, either than simple databases or than humans. And so it's an empirical question. You can go out, you can look for domains where maybe the advantages of the two aren't reconcilable. But I think that Google actually is a good case where they are.
Or maybe computers are augmenting our current intelligence and our current memory capabilities.
Oh, certainly they are. I mean, already, Google augments my memory many times a day.
Thank you.
It looks like the cue we're out of time. Thank you all very much.